The smoke was wrong. I noticed it first on the morning of October 17th, 1942, standing outside the operations building at Jever Airfield in northwestern Germany. A staffel of Bf-109Fs was returning from an intercept mission over the North Sea approaches, and as they touched down, the pilots were talking over each other, gesturing wildly with their hands. I was 26 years old then, a Hauptmann in the Luftwaffe's 3rd Fighter Wing, and I had seen American bomber formations before. But according to these pilots, something had changed. "They hit the rail yard," one of them said, pulling off his flying helmet. His face was flushed, whether from altitude or agitation I couldn't tell. "Just the rail yard. Not the whole damn city. The rail yard." I didn't understand what he meant. Not at first. The Americans had been trying daylight precision bombing for months by that point, sending their flying fortresses over the continent in neat formations, believing they could hit specific factories and infrastructure from 20,000 feet. We found this amusing. Our own bombing doctrine, refined over Poland and the Low Countries and Britain, relied on concentrated area attacks. You put enough bombs over a target area, and something important got destroyed. The idea that you could reliably hit a single building from 4 miles up, through flak and smoke and defensive maneuvers, struck most of us as either propaganda or delusion. But standing there on that October morning, listening to these pilots describe what they'd seen, I felt the first small seed of doubt. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Bremen raid, as we later learned to call it, targeted the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and the A.G. Weser shipyards. Intelligence reported that 91 American B-17 bombers had participated. Our fighters and flak had shot down 5 of them. But when the reconnaissance photographs came back from Bremen that afternoon, developed in the darkroom at Jever and spread across the map table in operations, we saw something that didn't match our understanding of how bombing worked. The Focke-Wulf plant had been hit, not the residential district beside it, not the streets behind it, the plant itself. The bombs had fallen in a cluster pattern that looked, from the air, almost deliberate, almost aimed. "Lucky," said Oberst Hahn, our wing commander. He was a veteran of the Battle of Britain, a man who'd watched German bombers struggle to hit London docks from far lower altitudes. They got lucky. I wanted to believe him. We all did. The war in October of 1942 still felt winnable to us. The Wehrmacht held everything from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Stalingrad. Our U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. Yes, the Americans were in the war now, but they were, still learning, still building their strength. They'd need years to match German industrial capacity and tactical expertise, we told ourselves. Years we could use to fortify Fortress Europe. The concept of precision bombing seemed to violate basic physics. A bomber flying at 20,000 feet moves at roughly 200 miles per hour. The bombs, once released, fall for nearly 30 seconds, during which time wind, air pressure, temperature, and the bomber's own motion all affect trajectory. German bombardiers used a simple mechanical sight, the Luftwaffe 7, that required the pilot to hold the aircraft absolutely steady during the bomb run, while the bombardier made manual calculations. Even under ideal conditions, with no flak and no fighters, our accuracy was measured in hundreds of meters. The Americans claimed their Norden Bombsight could do better. Much better. We'd heard rumors about this device since before the war. Intelligence reports described it as a closely guarded secret, supposedly capable of putting a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The Americans covered them with canvas tarps before missions. Guards stood over them with orders to destroy the device if the aircraft was going down. The bomb site itself reportedly cost more than the bomber carrying it. This struck us as American exaggeration. We knew about propaganda. We lived with propaganda. Every military in the world inflated its capabilities and downplayed its weaknesses. The Americans, we reasoned, were simply doing what we did, creating myths around their equipment to boost morale and intimidate enemies. But the Bremen photographs bothered me. I kept returning to them, studying the bomb crater patterns. They weren't random. They weren't scattered across the city grid the way our bombs had fallen over London or Coventry. They clustered around specific buildings, following what looked like an intentional pattern. Hauptmann Richter, said one of the intelligence officers, a studious Oberleutnant named Klaus, who'd been a mathematics teacher before the war. May I show you something? He spread 3 photographs across the table. All were reconnaissance shots of American bomber formations, taken by our fighters during different raids over the past month. Look at their formation discipline, Klaus said, pointing to the neat rectangles of bombers in each photograph. They don't break formation, even under fighter attack. They maintain precise altitude and spacing. And here, he indicated another photo showing bombs falling from a formation. They drop simultaneously, not individually. The entire formation releases together on a signal. So, I asked. So, their accuracy comes from mathematics and discipline, not luck. If one bomb site calculates the correct release point and transmits that signal to the formation, they all drop at once. The bombs fall in a pattern, a deliberate pattern. I looked at the photographs again. Klaus was right. The bomb release was coordinated, synchronized across multiple aircraft. It looked nothing like our own bombing procedures, where each bomber crew made independent calculations and dropped when ready. How do they synchronize it? I asked. Klaus shrugged. That's what the Norden Bombsight allegedly does. It's not just a site. According to captured technical documents, it's an analog computer. It calculates drift, altitude, airspeed, wind, ballistics, everything automatically. The bombardier just feeds in the numbers, and the device solves the equations. An analog computer for bombing. The concept seemed almost science fiction, something from a future war rather than the present one. German engineering was the finest in the world, we believed. Our aircraft, our tanks, our submarines were individually superior to Allied equipment, but we'd focused on making weapons better, faster, more powerful. The Americans, apparently, had focused on making weapons smarter. Weeks after Bremen brought more raids and more unsettling reconnaissance photographs. On November 7th, the Americans hit the U-boat pens at Brest. On November 9th, they targeted the Saint-Nazaire submarine base. On November 23rd, they struck the port facilities at Saint-Nazaire again. Each time, the bomb patterns showed the same characteristic clustering. Each time, the damage concentrated on the specific targets rather than spreading across the surrounding city. We shot down their bombers. Our fighters were skilled, and our flak was heavy. But the bombers that made it through their bomb runs hit what they aimed at with a consistency that seemed to defy probability. By December, I was attending daily intelligence briefings specifically focused on American bombing tactics and equipment. The Reich Luftwaffe Ministerium, the Reich Air Ministry, wanted to understand what we were facing. Reports came in from multiple sources. Interrogations of captured American aircrews, technical analysis of crashed bombers, intelligence gathered from neutral countries, even pre-war technical journals that had discussed the Norden development. A picture emerged, piece by piece, of what the Americans had built. The Norden Mark 15 bombsight consisted of 2 main components, a stabilizing platform and a calculating mechanism. The stabilization used a gyroscope to maintain a fixed reference point independent of the aircraft's motion. This was crucial. It meant the bombsight remained level and steady even when the bomber pitched or yawed. The calculating mechanism was essentially a mechanical computer using gears and cams to solve the ballistics equations in real time. The bombardier would first input the aircraft's altitude and airspeed. Then he'd look through the sight's telescope, which offered 50-power magnification, and identify the target. As the bomber flew toward the release point, the Norden would track the target and automatically calculate when to release, the bombs based on wind drift, ballistic trajectory, and the aircraft's ground speed. At the precise moment, It would trigger the release and could even control the bomber's autopilot during the bomb run, keeping the aircraft on course without human input. The device weighed about 50 pounds and required extensive training to operate. American bombardiers, we learned, spent months drilling with the Norden at training bases in the United States, practicing on targets until they could consistently hit within a circular error of less than 100 feet from 20,000 feet altitude. 100 feet. In ideal conditions, that meant the Americans could, theoretically, destroy any specific building they could see. Any factory, any power plant, any rail junction, any headquarters, any target small enough to identify from 4 miles up. In theory, the question that consumed us through that winter was whether they could do it in practice. Whether the Norden could maintain that accuracy under combat conditions with flak bursting around the formation, fighters attacking from all angles, clouds obscuring the target, smoke from previous bomb hits drifting across the aim point, and the tension of knowing that men were trying to kill you while you tried to hold steady for the bomb run. We got our answer in the spring. The date was April 17th, 1943. The target was the Focke-Wulf factory in Bremen. Again. The Americans had hit it before, but we'd repaired the damage and dispersed some production to satellite facilities. Now they were coming back. I was flying that day, leading a swarm of 4 Bf-109Gs on patrol over the North Sea approaches. We spotted the American formation at 1100 hours, coming in from the northwest. A rectangular box of B-17 bombers, 96 aircraft in tight formation, glinting in the spring sunlight like a swarm of silver insects. Their fighter escort P-47, Thunderbolts, orbited the flanks, waiting for us. We attacked from above and ahead, diving through the escort screen, trying to break up the formation before they reached Bremen. The Americans didn't break. They maintained formation discipline, their waist gunners and ball turret gunners firing steady streams of tracers that created a defensive curtain of lead. I watched 3 of our fighters go down in that first pass. The P-47s chased us off before we could make a second attack. The formation continued toward Bremen, and I followed at a distance, climbing back to altitude to observe. The flak opened up as they crossed the coast, our 88mm guns putting up a curtain of black bursts around the formation. 2 bombers fell out, trailing smoke, but the others held position, continuing straight toward the city. I could see Bremen from where I circled, 15 kilometers to the east. The Focke-Wulf plant was visible as a dark rectangular complex on the edge of the city, bordered by residential streets and a rail line. The American formation was heading directly for it. Then, at exactly the moment they reached their bomb release point, the bomb bay doors opened, all of them, simultaneously. And the bombs fell. From my altitude I could see them, small dark shapes tumbling from the bellies of the bombers, hundreds of them, falling in unison. They took 30 seconds to reach the ground, and during that half-minute I watched them arc downward, seeming to drift in the wind, black specks against the green German landscape. They hit the factory, all of them, or nearly all. The explosions walked across the Focke-Wulf complex in a neat pattern, building after building erupting in fire and smoke. The residential district beside the factory remained untouched. The rail line took a few stray impacts, but the factory itself, the specific target, received the concentrated weight of the attack. I descended to investigate after the Americans turned for home. The factory was devastated. The main assembly building had collapsed. The machine shops were burning. The administrative block had been reduced to rubble, and all around the factory perimeter, civilian buildings stood intact. Damaged by blast waves and shrapnel, certainly, but structurally sound. The Americans had hit what they'd aimed at. This wasn't luck. This was capability. I filed my mission report that evening with a sick feeling in my stomach. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could do this, consistently hit specific factories while leaving the surrounding city relatively intact, then our entire defensive strategy was obsolete. We'd based our air defense doctrine on the assumption that bombers couldn't be accurate enough to justify precision attacks. We'd concentrated our critical industries in known locations, protected them with heavy flak, and accepted that some percentage of production would be lost to area bombing. The calculation had made sense, when bombing was essentially random. But if bombing wasn't random anymore, if every factory could be targeted individually, if every power plant, every rail junction, every oil refinery could be hit with near certainty, then we would have to disperse everything. Spread production across dozens or hundreds of smaller facilities. Move critical infrastructure underground. Reorganize our entire industrial base around the assumption that anything visible from the air was vulnerable. The cost of such reorganization would be catastrophic, not just in resources and time, but in efficiency. Mass production required concentration. Specialized machinery, skilled workers, established supply chains, all of these depended on having facilities large enough to justify the investment. Breaking a major aircraft factory into 20 smaller workshops scattered across the countryside meant duplicating tools, training new workers, establishing new logistics networks, and accepting lower production rates at higher cost. But what choice did we have? The spring and summer of 1943 brought a systematic campaign that proved the Bremen raid was no anomaly. The Americans were getting better. Their formations grew larger, their fighter escorts extended farther into Germany, and their bombing accuracy remained unnervingly consistent. On May 1st, they hit the U-boat yards at Wilhelmshaven. The bomb pattern analysis showed 70% of impacts within 500 meters of the aim point. On May 13th, they struck the Focke-Wulf plant at Marienburg, the same factory we'd dispersed to after Bremen. Again, the damage concentrated on the industrial buildings. On May 29th, back to U-boat facilities, this time at La Palisse. The pattern held. We weren't just fighting bombers anymore, we were fighting mathematics. The Norden Bombsight, we now understood, had turned bombing from an approximate art into something approaching a science. Not a perfect science combat. Conditions still degraded accuracy considerably from the theoretical 100-foot capability. Weather, smoke, battle damage to the aircraft, crew fatigue, all these reduced real-world precision. But even degraded, even operating at half or a quarter of its theoretical accuracy, the Norden gave American crews a capability that exceeded anything we possessed. Our own attempts to develop comparable technology had begun too late. German bombsight development had focused on dive bombing the Stukas and their precision attacks at steep angles. Horizontal bombing from high altitude had seemed less important because we'd assumed it was inherently inaccurate. By the time we recognized our error, the Americans had a 5-year head start and thousands of trained bombardiers. I was reassigned in June to the fighter operations staff at Luftwaffe 3 headquarters, tasked with developing tactical responses to American precision bombing. It was, I quickly realized, an almost impossible assignment. How do you defend against an enemy who can hit any target they can see? We tried concentrating flak. The Americans flew through it. We tried massed fighter attacks. The Americans added more fighter escorts and more defensive guns. We tried attacking the formations head-on, from below, from the sides. We developed rockets, cannons, even specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft. Nothing stopped them. For every bomber we shot down, 2 more made it through to drop their loads with that characteristic, terrifying accuracy. The intelligence reports from that summer made for grim reading. An analysis of 37 American raids between April and July showed an average bombing accuracy measured as the distance from aim point to the center of the bomb cluster of approximately 1,000 feet. 1,000 feet. That meant a circular target area, about 1/3 of a mile across, received the concentrated impact of hundreds of bombs. Any factory complex in Germany fell well within that circle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic turning point came in August. The target was Schweinfurt. Schweinfurt was a mid-sized city in Bavaria, notable for one thing: ball bearings. The city produced nearly half of Germany's ball bearing supply, and ball bearings were essential for virtually every weapon system we built. Aircraft engines needed them. Tank transmissions needed them. U-boat diesel engines needed them. Without ball bearings, the entire German war machine would seize up like an engine without oil. The Americans knew this, and on August 17, 1943, they came for Schweinfurt. I wasn't there for the raid itself. I was at headquarters, coordinating fighter response, but I followed the battle through radio reports and later through debriefings and reconnaissance photographs. The Americans launched a dual attack that day. 146 bombers targeted Schweinfurt, while 146 more struck the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The attacks were timed to split our fighter defenses and maximize the strain on our response capability. It worked. We shot down 36 American bombers that day, our highest single-day total. But the survivors reached their targets, and when they did, the Norden Bombsights did what they were designed to do. The reconnaissance photographs from Schweinfurt showed devastation so precise it looked surgical. The 5 main ball-bearing factories, Kugelfischer, FAG, Fichtel and Sachs, all clustered in the city centre, had been systematically destroyed. The bombs had walked through the industrial complex, building by building, reducing months of production capacity to rubble in less than 15 minutes. Housing districts a few blocks away showed minor damage. Churches and schools were mostly intact, but the factories themselves had been gutted. German ball-bearing production dropped by 38% overnight. 38%. And it took us 6 months to recover even half of that lost capacity, and only then by dispersing production to dozens of smaller facilities at enormous cost and efficiency. That was when I understood the true genius of the Norden Bombsight. It wasn't just a targeting device, it was an economic weapon. It allowed the Americans to attack Germany's industrial base with surgical precision, destroying bottleneck industries that were impossible to quickly replace or disperse. One successful raid could ripple through our entire production network, delaying tank production, grounding aircraft, limiting U-boat operations. And we couldn't stop it. The Americans came back to Schweinfurt on October 14th. We threw everything at them: 300 fighters, concentrated flak, every tactical innovation we'd developed over the summer. We shot down 60 bombers. 60. It should have been a victory. But the attack succeeded anyway. The ball-bearing factories, partially rebuilt after August, were destroyed again. Production dropped even further. The second Schweinfurt raid forced a fundamental strategic decision. We could no longer concentrate critical production in vulnerable locations. Every factory would need to be dispersed, regardless of cost. Every piece of infrastructure would need backup systems. We would have to reorganize German industry around the assumption that anything the Americans could see, they could destroy. This reorganization consumed resources we desperately needed elsewhere. Workers who should have been building tanks were instead dismantling factories and moving machinery to new locations. Steel that should have gone to U-boats went to building underground facilities. Transportation networks that should have supplied the Eastern Front instead moved industrial equipment across the Reich. The economic impact was staggering. German aircraft production, which should have increased throughout 1943, instead plateaued. Tank production fell behind schedule. Even ammunition production suffered as factories were moved and workers were reassigned, all because of precision bombing and the device that made it possible. I saw a captured Norden Bombsight once, in late 1943. Intelligence had recovered it from a crashed B-17 near Münster, mostly intact despite the impact. They'd brought it to our headquarters for analysis, laid out on a table like a dissected mechanical animal. It was smaller than I'd expected, about the size of a large typewriter, housed in a metal box with a telescope protruding from the top. The gyroscope assembly was visible through an access panel, a complex arrangement of spinning wheels and gimbals that maintained stability. The calculating mechanism consisted of dozens of gears and cams, each precisely machined to solve a specific part of the ballistics equation. It was, in its way, beautiful, a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. The Americans had taken the problem of high-altitude bombing, a problem that involved wind, altitude, airspeed, gravity, ballistic trajectory, and human reaction time, and encoded the solution into metal and gears. Feed in the inputs, and the device would output the exact release point. Simple, elegant, devastating. "We could build this," said one of our engineers, studying the mechanism. "It's not beyond our capabilities. The machining is precise but not impossible. The principles are sound." "How long?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "To design from scratch? 2 years, perhaps 3, to get it into production. To copy this one? Maybe 18 months if we prioritize it." 18 months. By then, the war would likely be decided. The Americans already had thousands of these devices in service, with trained crews who'd been practicing for years. Even if we built our own version, what would we use it for? We no longer had the bomber fleets, or the fuel reserves, or the air superiority to conduct strategic bombing campaigns. The Norden Bombsight had arrived too late for us to copy and too early for us to counter. The winter of 1943 brought a different kind of campaign. The Americans shifted focus from precision strikes on specific factories to broader attacks on German cities, Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg. But even in these raids, the Norden influence was visible. The bombs clustered around industrial districts and transportation hubs rather than spreading randomly across residential areas. The destruction was still enormous, still horrific, but it was directed destruction, aimed destruction, bombing with purpose and precision. By early 1944, the strategic situation had become untenable. Our fighter losses were unsustainable. Our industrial production continued falling. The dispersion program had saved some capability, but at massive cost. And the Americans kept coming wave after wave, their formations growing larger and their fighter escorts more numerous. I remember a briefing in March of 1944, where an intelligence officer presented data on American bombing accuracy over the previous year. The average circular error, he reported, had improved from roughly 1,000 feet in mid-1943 to about 800 feet by early 1944. The Americans were getting better with practice. Their bombardiers were more experienced. Their maintenance crews had learned to keep the Norden sights calibrated under field conditions. Their tactical procedures had been refined through repeated combat. 800 feet, said General Oberst Stumpf, commander of Luftwaffe Reich. That's still far from the 200 feet they claim in their propaganda. Yes, sir, the intelligence officer agreed. But 200 feet was always theoretical, achieved only under perfect conditions at test ranges. 800 feet, under combat conditions, is still extraordinary. It means they can destroy any target complex larger than a city block. Stumpf was silent for a long moment, staring at the maps showing American raid patterns across Germany. Finally, he said, "Then we've lost the air war. We just don't know it yet." He was right, of course. The Norden Bombsight hadn't won the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it had changed the strategic calculus in a fundamental way. It had made America's industrial advantage matter more by allowing that advantage to be applied precisely. Every bomber that reached its target struck at German production in a way that couldn't be quickly repaired or replaced. Every precision raid forced more dispersion, more reorganization, more economic strain. The device had made strategic bombing strategic in a way it had never been before. I survived the war. Many of my comrades did not. After the surrender, during the occupation, I had conversations with American bomber crews, comparing experiences from opposite sides of the flak bursts and fighter attacks. One bombardier, a captain from Ohio who'd flown 35 missions over Germany, showed me photographs of his Norden training at Midland Army Airfield in Texas. "We'd drop practice bombs on circles marked on the desert," he said. "Start at 10,000 feet, work up to 20,000, then 25,000. The instructors wanted us to consistently hit within 100 feet of the aim point. Most of us could do it, eventually, if conditions were perfect. Clear weather, no wind, no one shooting at us. And in combat? I asked. He laughed, but there was no humour in it. In combat? Different story. Flak throwing the plane around, fighters attacking. Half the time you couldn't see the target through the smoke from the lead squadron's bombs. Wind gusts you couldn't predict. Ice forming on the site. Fear making your hands shake. A good bombardier might hit within 500 feet. A great one might do 300. The Norden gave us the capability to be precise, but combat conditions took away half of that. Half was enough, I said. Yeah, he agreed quietly. I guess it was. The device itself became obsolete within a few years of the war's end. Radar bombing offered all-weather capability. Early computers could calculate ballistics faster and more accurately. Guided missiles eliminated the need for free-fall accuracy. The Norden Bombsight, revolutionary in 1943, was a museum piece by 1950. But in its time, for those few critical years when the war's outcome hung in balance, the Norden had mattered enormously. It had turned American industrial power into strategic advantage. It had forced Germany to reorganize its entire economy under fire. It had proven that precision could be achieved from 20,000 feet, that individual targets could be destroyed while minimizing collateral damage, that bombing could be something more than simply dropping explosives and hoping for the best. The propaganda had called it a device that could put a bomb in a pickle barrel. That was an exaggeration, certainly, but it could hit a factory. It could destroy a power plant. It could wreck a rail yard. And in the context of strategic warfare, that was more than enough. I think about those first missions I witnessed, the neat pattern of bombs falling on Bremen, the precision strikes on Schweinfurt, the systematic destruction of German industry through the deliberate application of American technological advantage. We'd been told it was impossible. We'd believed our own propaganda about German superiority and Allied incompetence. We'd assumed that certain things like precision bombing from high altitude simply couldn't be done. We were wrong. The Americans had built a device that made the impossible routine. They'd trained thousands of men to use it. They'd integrated it into a strategic bombing campaign that reshaped warfare, and they'd done it while we were still assuming it couldn't be done at all. That, perhaps, was the deepest lesson of the Norden Bombsight. Not that technology wins wars, technology is always only part of the equation, but that assumptions about what's possible can be as dangerous as any weapon. We'd assumed high-altitude precision bombing was impractical. We'd built our strategy around that assumption. And when the assumption proved false, our entire defensive doctrine collapsed. The morning I first saw those bomb patterns over Bremen, I felt doubt. By Schweinfurt, I felt certainty. By the end of the war, I felt something closer to respect. The Americans had identified a problem how to destroy specific targets from high altitude, and solved it with engineering, training, and systematic execution. The Norden Bombsight was the crystallization of that solution, 50 pounds of gears and gyroscopes that changed the geometry of warfare. We hated it not because it was cruel or indiscriminate, but because it was precise, because it worked. Because every mission that reached its target proved that our defenses were inadequate and our assumptions were wrong. Because it represented a kind of bombing we'd believed was impossible, delivered with a consistency we'd believed was unachievable, targeting our industry with an accuracy we'd believed was theoretical. The Americans had promised to put bombs in pickle barrels. They couldn't quite do that, not really, not under combat conditions, but they could hit the building where the pickle barrels were made. They could destroy the factory that produced the machinery for making the barrels. They could wreck the rail line that transported the barrels to market. And for strategic bombing, for industrial warfare, for the systematic dismantling of an enemy's capacity to fight, that was enough. More than enough. That was the lesson written in smoke and rubble across Germany from 1943 onward. The Norden Bombsight made precision bombing real, and once it was real, Once we knew it was possible, everything else followed inevitably. The dispersion programs, the underground factories, the economic strain, the defensive reorganization, the strategic calculations that led, step by step, to defeat. A 50-pound box of gears and gyroscopes, that's all it was, but it changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.